A few weeks ago, U.S. AFRICOM Commander General Michael Langley made a statement so outrageous it sent shockwaves across the continent. He accused President Ibrahim Traoré of using Burkina Faso's gold to protect himself, a remark that ignited fury in the hearts of Pan-Africanists everywhere. What Langley likely didn't anticipate was that this single comment would turn him into public enemy number one for millions of Africans. But that's exactly what happened. And now, just days ago, General Langley resurfaced in Kenya, attending the annual African Chiefs of Defense Conference. Following the event, he sat down for a private interview, an attempt, it seems, to walk back his earlier words and clarify what he really meant about Traoré and Burkina Faso. But was it a clarification or another veiled insult? In today's video, we break down Langley's remarks, decode the true message behind them, and reveal what this says about the West's attitude toward Africa's new wave of revolutionary leaders. Before we dive into General Langley's interview, we want to ask a very simple question. When will African countries learn to do things for themselves? Why do they have to depend on the West for everything? The reason we're asking these questions is because of the annual African Chiefs of Defense Conference. You see, when we first heard about this conference, we assumed it was organized by the African Union, perhaps as a platform to discuss and collaborate on security issues across the continent. However, further research revealed that this conference has actually been organized by U.S. AFRICOM every year since 2017. According to the U.S. AFRICOM commander, the purpose of this conference is to bring together defense chiefs from various African countries to discuss the security challenges facing the continent. While this may sound noble on the part of U.S. AFRICOM, it is absolutely disheartening that a foreign power is the one organizing a continental conference on African security. This situation only underscores the unfortunate reality that the African continent is still perceived as unable to solve its own security problems without external assistance. How can the West truly learn to respect Africa when Africa continues to project the image that it relies on others for its solutions? The truth is, the day Africa stops depending on the West is the day the continent will truly begin to grow. The worst part is that the so-called help offered to Africa has often done more harm than good. We'll discuss this in more detail later. Now consider this. For a conference that is supposedly focused on Africa's security challenges, the location has consistently been outside the African continent. Imagine that. How does that even make sense? The truth is, it doesn't. But we shouldn't be surprised. After all, it's the same way African leaders routinely fly to the US for the so-called US-Africa Summit. What does this tell you? Just like the summit, the African Chiefs of Defense Conference seems to be more about maintaining control than actually providing real, lasting solutions. And unfortunately, it appears that many of the military leaders involved are either unaware of this or unwilling to challenge it. Now, it wasn't until last year that the conference was held in Africa for the first time. It was hailed as historic by African leaders and Africa's top military men. However, in our opinion, the only reason why the U.S. AFRICOM decided to hold the conference in Africa was to regain its influence. You see, in 2024, Niger, a country in the Sahel whose military forces cannot stand against the U.S. military, kicked the U.S. military out. It was the first time such a thing happened to the U.S. in Africa. Coupled together with the fact that the military leaders of the Sahel has turned to non-Western countries, the U.S. began to realize that it is beginning to lose its military influence in Africa. This is why it has decided to begin to hold the conference in Africa. While last year's conference was held in Botswana, this year's conference was organized in Kenya between May 28th and May 29th, 2025. Top military leaders from 37 African countries attended the conference to exchange knowledge, strengthen partnerships, and address shared security challenges across the continent. According to the report, the 2025 Africa Chief of Defense Conference focused on topics including counterterrorism, regional stability, maritime security, and the importance of civilian-military relations, with an emphasis on African-led, US-enabled solutions. It was during an interview, just before the conference began on Wednesday, that General Michael Langley, the current commander of US AFRICOM, defended his controversial statement about President Traoré. According to General Langley, his remarks were taken out of context by President Traoré and others who criticized him. He claimed that his statement was intended strictly from a military perspective, emphasizing the urgency of addressing the escalating terrorist threat within Burkina Faso. That statement, he said, was a military-to-military comment grounded in the context of the growing terrorist activity concentrated within Burkina Faso, an epicenter for several terrorist organizations. He further explained, "The purpose of my statement was to underscore the need for more resources to confront the broader problem of terrorism across the country." The U.S. AFRICOM commander further clarified that his remarks focused on military resource management and the apparent inadequacy of external support provided to counter violent extremism in the region and not to question Burkina Faso's sovereignty. My comments were reflective of concerns about military resourcing management and what military external support they were getting to fight terrorism was insufficient, he added. Langley also acknowledged the sovereignty of Burkina Faso, affirming that it is within the country's rights to make independent decisions regarding its internal security and alliances. Burkina Faso, like any nation, makes independent decisions regarding their own security and also the selection of partners. That is their freedom and right, he said. So, in essence, General Langley is now claiming that when he said President Traoré was using Burkina Faso's gold for his own protection, he actually meant that Traoré wasn't allocating enough resources to fight insecurity. From his explanation, it also implies that Burkina Faso isn't receiving sufficient external funding to combat terrorism. But how does that even make sense? How does making a negative remark about the president of a sovereign nation reflect genuine concern for its security situation? It doesn't. It's absolute nonsense. Frankly, it would have been better if he had simply said, "No comment," rather than try to twist his words in such a contradictory way. It's obvious that General Langley is just trying to be diplomatic now. He saw the overwhelming support President Traoré received. He witnessed the backlash across Africa in response to his comments, and he realized he had made a serious blunder. That's why he's now backpedaling, trying to save face by changing the narrative and softening his stance. Anyone who watched that video of General Langley's accusations against Traoré could clearly see that the statement was a deliberate attack on President Traoré and the military leaders of the Sahel. It wasn't made out of concern for Burkina Faso's insecurity. However, given the backlash he has received from Africa, which is supposed to be his jurisdiction, General Langley has decided to change his statement. What nonsense. Besides the fact that he is just being diplomatic, his current statement is even wrong. We can boldly say that more than any Burkinabe leader before him, President Traoré has put in a lot of resources into fighting insecurity and terrorism. Before President Traoré came into the picture, the Burkinabe military force was badly inadequate both in terms of skills and capabilities. They didn't have access to good weapons. Their living conditions and wages were pretty low, and the government never thought of investing heavily in the country's defense. Meanwhile, the French military was in the country, supposedly training the Burkinabe soldiers. Instead of guns, the soldiers used wooden guns to train. And the French military advisors never thought of advising the government to invest in the country's defense. Imagine that. The worst part is that even when the money was available to buy military weapons, France stopped them from getting good weapons. According to the Burkinabe defense minister, France did not only dictate where Burkina Faso should buy weapons from, it also dictated which weapons should be bought. Most of the time, Burkina Faso bought outdated weapons at expensive costs. It was a terrible period for the Burkinabe Defense Force. However, Traoré's entrance into the country's leadership scene changed everything. Since he took power, security has been his priority, and as such, he has invested massively in the Burkinabe Defense Force. He has spent billions of CFA francs acquiring high-grade weapons and ammunition for the military. He has invested heavily in the training of Burkinabe soldiers. No longer will these soldiers use wooden guns to train. He has expanded the military, built a separate militia group, and placed 24/7 security in certain parts of the country. He has also established the AES with Mali and Niger and formed a joint force of 5,000 troops. With all this in mind, how can General Langley confidently claim that President Traoré hasn't invested enough in fighting insecurity? Let's expand on that question. What exactly has AFRICOM achieved in combating insecurity in Africa since its establishment in 2007? And more specifically, what has General Langley himself done to counter terrorism on the continent? General Langley doesn't live in Burkina Faso. He doesn't wake up to the constant threat of violence in the Sahel. Yet, he seems to have strong opinions on what African leaders should and shouldn't be doing. It's a bold stance for someone overseeing a command that, since 2007, has presided over a steady increase in terrorism and instability across the region. AFRICOM has had nearly 2 decades to make a difference, but instead of reducing insecurity, the situation has only worsened under its watch. And somehow, no one is holding AFRICOM accountable for this failure. So, as we stated earlier, General Langley should have just refused to comment on his previous statement or simply agreed that he made a mistake. However, regardless of whatever he says, one thing is clear: the solution to Africa's security challenges lies in Africa and not the US. Think about it. The Africa Chief of Defense Conference has been held every year since 2017. The question is, what has been the outcome of this conference? What has been the impact of the conference on the African military? How has it made the militaries better? If insecurity has grown even faster since the inception of this conference, then there is absolutely no need for the conference. Till today, African countries continue to struggle to get certain weapons from the West, especially the US and France. And yet, the US insists on partnering with Africa. What sort of partnerships is that? This is why we say that nobody can help Africa get better except Africans themselves. The honest fact is that every country, including the US, China, and Russia, are on the lookout for their own interest. This is a sentiment echoed by General Langley during the opening speech of the conference. In his speech, General Langley noted that while the US is willing to partner with member states to achieve shared goals, the burden of securing the continent falls on Africa's military chiefs. My mandate from the National Command Authority is clear: counter terrorism, with a specific focus on threats to the United States homeland. I can't promise to be everywhere, and I recognize the challenges you face with our equipping process. Our leadership is conducting a comprehensive review to improve alignment with US policy and streamline effectiveness, he added. General Langley's words are clear enough. The United States is not in Africa to fight terrorism for Africa's sake. It is here to defend US interests and eliminate any threat that could challenge those interests. As we've stated in one of our previous videos, the US has already neutralized terrorism on its own soil. Armed groups and terrorist organizations don't even dare to operate within US borders. This is thanks to a highly organized defense system and a deeply ingrained patriotic security culture. So the question remains, why is AFRICOM in Africa? Let's be honest. AFRICOM, established in 2007, was never about protecting Africa. It was created primarily to safeguard the strategic and economic interests of the United States on the continent. Everything else, security partnerships, counterterrorism efforts, and military cooperation, is secondary to that goal. Imagine this scenario. The United States approaches an African nation and proposes the establishment of a military base on its soil. The African government declines, but then the US returns, this time with a threat. Not a military one, but an economic and diplomatic warning. If the country refuses, it risks losing access to critical financial support, perhaps a long-awaited loan from the IMF or World Bank. This is the silent pressure unfolding behind closed doors, though few are willing to speak about it openly. In truth, the US leverages its position as the largest financial contributor to the International Monetary Fund to influence decisions across the African continent, particularly on matters of security and military cooperation. As legal scholar Zora Ahmed aptly noted, the kinds of international relationships the United States cultivates in support of its wars fall somewhere in a legal gray zone between consent and coercion. And for many African governments, already burdened by economic hardship and reliant on foreign loans to stay afloat, there is little choice but to comply with US demands. It is a devastating irony. The very nation that speaks the loudest about human dignity, justice, sovereignty, and rights is the same one quietly undermining those principles, exploiting its power to impose its will on others simply because it can. Even though AFRICOM claims to be working in partnership with African countries, not to fight wars, but to prevent them, the reality tells a different story. The operations of the US military in Africa are often shrouded in secrecy. In many cases, African governments are not even informed about what US operatives are doing on their soil, let alone why they are doing it. And yet, this is called a partnership. Basic information, like the scale of elite US troop deployments or the nature of clandestine combat missions, is rarely reported or disclosed to the public across Africa. If you've seen our video on US secret biolabs in Africa, you already know that, with the support of the US military, hundreds of laboratories have been quietly set up across the continent. Some of these, it is alleged, have even been used to conduct experiments on local populations. The question is, if these operations are truly legitimate and in the interest of African security, why are they kept secret from the very governments and people they claim to be helping? What exactly is being hidden? And more importantly, if AFRICOM's presence is really about stopping terrorism, then why is terrorism more widespread now than ever before across the continent? The US military entered the African continent under the assumption that Africa couldn't solve its own problems, that its governments were too weak and its people too incapable. That was the justification. Since 2007, AFRICOM has operated across the continent under the banner of preventing war and insecurity. With all their high-grade military technology, elite forces, and global intelligence networks, they've conducted countless secret missions throughout Africa. And yet, despite all of this, they failed to stop the rise of terrorism. Islamist jihadists emerged in Mali and rapidly spread across the Sahel region. Are we really supposed to believe that with all their advanced surveillance systems and intelligence operations, they were unaware of the jihadist threat? And if they were aware, why didn't they act decisively when the threat first emerged? The truth is becoming clearer. Fighting terrorism wasn't the real reason AFRICOM was created. It was the excuse. As we've said before, AFRICOM exists in Africa not to protect Africans, but to advance American interests, military, strategic, and economic. It's about expanding US influence, securing access to Africa's rich mineral resources, and countering the growing presence of China and Russia on the continent. That's the reality. And now, the question falls to African nations. Will they continue playing a role in helping the US defend its interests, or will they begin to defend their own? What do you think? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.